Thank you, everyone, for
Thank
that
you.
really interesting presentation and discussion. So, hello, I'm Anne Whitaker, and I'm going to move straight into the first presentation of people who submitted abstracts. And the topic is around parents and children affected by substance use. And I'm delighted to invite, hopefully, both Simon Barrett and Deborah Smart from Newcastle University, I think, in England, who are going to do a talk on exploring perspectives of parents and caregivers in the context of another parent's substance use, and then co-producing a book to aid conversations about parental substance use with children. These are two linked studies. And with any luck, Simon and Deborah will be able to now introduce themselves. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Are you there, Simon? And just
I
put
am,
your
yes.
camera on, and everyone will keep their cameras off whilst you do your presentation.
So I believe mine is on. And can you see the screen? You can see the slides?
We can see them. They look
Super.
good, yeah.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. Thank you, Anne, for that introduction, especially with that overlong title. So I appreciate that. I won't repeat the title that we have here. So hi everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to present our research findings to you today. And as Anne said, my name is Simon, and I'm from Newcastle University here in the UK. And along with my colleague Debbie, we're going to talk to you about two linked studies, both of which are focused on supporting non-substance using parents or caregivers in substance-exposed families. And so some background to this research, which is familiar to everyone here, I'm sure. Parental substance use is a prevalent and substantial public health and safeguarding concern, with around 500,000 children in England living with a parental figure who has a dependency on alcohol or other drugs. And there is established evidence on the potential harms this can have on all family members. And we know that dependent age children are particularly vulnerable. And while we know, as mentioned by the previous speakers, that reducing substance use itself is very important, we also know that many parents cannot or do not access this treatment. And so finding other ways of supporting Sorry, I've just lost my slides. I've gone in a different order there, big pardon. So finding other ways of supporting families is important then, and especially when we know that the presence of a stable or supportive caregiver can drastically improve outcomes for children in substance-exposed families. So this raises the question then of how best to support caregivers to help them in turn support the children in their care. And this is the focus of Safe Space, one of the two linked studies which we mentioned, which I will talk about today. And later, Deborah will describe the Spring study and how these studies came together to inform the development of an intervention to support substance-exposed families. And so as part of Safe Space, it was a comprehensive work of various strands and various work packages, but I'm going to focus today on the qualitative aspect of Safe Space. And so part of Safe Space, we spoke to 19 caregivers, 10 of whom were biological parents, 4 were grandparents, and 5 others had alternative kinship care arrangements in place. And importantly, all of these caregivers fulfilled the main parenting role for children affected by substance use of another parent. The people we spoke to were recruited from the northeast of England. They were mostly female, and they were aged between 25 to 65 plus. And the children in their care were aged between 4 to 17 years of age. Some of the families that we spoke to still lived with the substance-using parents. Some had separated and still had contact, and some of the families no longer had any contact at all. So from the interviews, we identified 3 main themes, which I'll give a brief overview of today. And so the first one of which is challenges when caregiving in the context of a family member's substance use. And as we might expect, the challenges faced by caregivers were complex and varied, but I suppose they can best be summarized as disruption to their lives and to their relationships, as well as cumulative stress and guilt. And so we found that parents were trying to keep the family together often while being pulled in often opposing directions, trying to care for children, trying to look after themselves, and at the same time provide support for substance using parents. And so some illustrative quotes here, which give you an overview of what I'm talking about here. So this mother tells us that she didn't feel like there was a way out, that she'd hit rock bottom and attempted suicide. But at the same time, despite all of this disruption and these difficulties she was facing, she didn't want to uproot her children and take them to a refuge. When you've got a family, you've got to try and hold it all together, and you feel like there's no way out of that. And I guess the other side of that coin is this father describes how he felt really guilty. He thought he was doing a favor by staying in the relationship, but he wasn't. And then when that relationship ended, he still carried around that guilt about how he didn't take his children away from that situation. So two sides of the same coin there. And this grandparent tells us how, again, this disruption to her life, or this sudden change in her life, came about when at 61 years old, she found herself taking care of a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. And she described how her life changed totally. And she said she felt like she's in the middle of balancing plates, and especially when she was being torn in different directions, where she was being told by support services, this is what you need to do for your substance using daughter, and this is what you need to do for your grandchildren. The second theme we identified was problems usually around interactions with support services, and generally here we're talking about statutory support services. That being said, many caregivers did describe good and positive interactions with support services, but I guess the focus here is really the problem ones, so we can identify where that goes wrong. When it came to interactions with services, there was a perception that support services are focused on the recovery of the substance user. Caregivers talked about stigma and judgment and concern over adverse consequences of asking for help and involving particularly statutory support services. So again, some illustrative quotes here, which this mother tells us that she was scared and she found herself in the same place with no help from anyone because she was hesitant to talk about and even mention drugs or alcohol. And then she felt at the same time that her ex-partner was getting lots of support, and she was left to deal with not only the issues that she was facing, but the issues her children were facing, and she was left to deal with that by herself. Caregivers talked about this idea of being given responsibility for often traumatized children without any appropriate support and with no training, and feeling abandoned by services because it was felt their involvement was only about making sure children were safe. And so this grandparent tells us you just get handed your grandchildren who are traumatized. And this parent tells us how eventually she did get some help from statutory services. Somebody came out to see the family, was working with the family. But as soon as they recognized or felt that she was safeguarding the children, then they withdrew any help and said that there was no more that they could do for her. So then she describes how she felt she was in a worse position because she had asked for help. The case had been closed and nobody else was able to or prepared to help her as far as she was that's concerned. And then the last theme that I'm going to talk to you about today is talking to children about a parent's substance use. So almost all of the caregivers described worries over how and when to talk to children about their parents' substance use and the impacts it had on the family. They often described how they waited for children to ask or only spoke to children once they'd been told things by somebody else. And I guess you can see from the first couple of quotes here that I've highlighted that this often created a dichotomy for some caregivers who had found counselling for their children, but felt that this support wasn't as helpful as it could have been because children couldn't talk openly or fully understand the family situation. So these parents tell us how they'd kept their children in the dark, so the counsellors didn't have a lot to work with, and the counsellor was afraid to poke too much because she wasn't sure about bringing up topics that the child didn't want to talk about or wasn't aware of. And while many appreciated the support they had received in talking to their children, especially from social workers and family support workers, there was often a sense that actually if this wasn't handled correctly, then this could make the situation worse. So the final quote here is one from a grandparent who tells us that she didn't want to talk to her grandchildren about the substance use within the family or the impact this had had on the family. But the statutory social services, the welfare services, felt that this was something that should be done, and they did this against her wishes. And she describes how it felt like they came along, within 5 minutes they'd gone, then chucked a hand grenade in and walked out and left her to deal with the fallout and the consequences of that. And so there's a QR code there, so you can link to the paper, but just to summarize the main findings. So the families that we spoke to were affected by violence, suicide ideation and attempts, and disruption to their lives. They felt they were balancing the needs of traumatized children, their own responsibilities towards the parent who uses, and their own stress. There was a perception that support was not available, or if support did come, it came when they were at a crisis point or they'd been coping alone for many years. There was a hesitancy to seek support. There was fear of stigma and judgment. There were echoes of victim-blaming practices which focus upon the caregiver's failure to protect, or a withdrawal of that support when it was recognised that they were doing the minimum and safeguarding children. And in a situation where they described feeling abandoned by services, or that the situation was worse by their involvement. Caregivers struggled with knowing when and how to raise issues with children, and what to talk about and when with children. But some did tell us that story work was appreciated by some caregivers, and especially when they had support in doing that story work. So I guess that's where I hand over to Debbie, who will talk to you about how this informs the next part of the study.
Thanks, Simon. I'm just going to press my take control button so I can coordinate the slides.
I'm going to give you control. There you go.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to be delivering the second part of this session, which is based on how we took the findings that Simon's just told you about from the Safe Space study, along with the findings from a colleague's study called Spring, and co-produced a storybook with families that assisted them to have conversations with children around parental substance use. So we use the findings of these two studies to really bring them to life, really, and something that was a useful resource for families to use. And ultimately produced a book called Twinkle Twinkle Artie. So I'm going to tell you about how that came about. So at the same time the Safe Space study was going on, a colleague, Cassie Muir, was undertaking her PhD studies in something called Spring, which was looking at the impact of parental substance use on young people. And just to kind of highlight some of the top level findings from the Spring study, some of the key areas that young people raised was that they felt alone and they felt different, that they didn't always know that other young people had similar experiences to them, which can contribute to the stigma associated with parental substance use. They felt that nobody understood, which again contributes to that stigma and feelings of loneliness when they had no association with other young people who were impacted by parental substance use. The uncertainty created by parental substance use on family life can leave young people trying to preempt what might happen and feeling responsible for managing difficult situations. And it can be overwhelming with lots of conflicting emotions of love, anger, resentment. And in the context of feeling like nobody understands, that can be really challenging for young people to manage. So what young people asked for and wanted from support was contact with other young people who had similar experiences, seeking that reassurance that they weren't the only one, and that there were other young people who had a shared understanding of what family life was like when you had a parent who used substances. So there was an opportunity to, through an Impact Accelerator Award, to produce a resource for families who were impacted by parental substance use that responded to some of the challenges that they faced and we had been told about in both the Spring study and the Safe Space study. And this was specific to addressing the emotional support needs that children have. So we involved a group of around 20 people. That included parents who didn't use substances predominantly, children, young adults who had been impacted as children but now had the opportunity to reflect on their experiences and what that was like for them as children. Education practitioners, predominantly teachers, an author and an illustrator. And we began to bring together the findings of the studies and develop a book for 5 to 8-year-olds. And the focus of a resource for 5 to 8-year-olds was influenced by young people in the spring study who highlighted the need for a primary school age intervention, and also in a way that schools could utilise the resource and play a role in supporting children. So you'll see here a couple of pictures from a workshop we held with families where we were starting to discuss the key findings and kind of come up with ideas for characters and what those personalities and character traits might be and reflect the different roles within families. So during our workshop that included the author, the illustrator and family members, we were developing the characters and what they might do, the actions they might take, how we might learn about them throughout the story. But some of the key aspects of what we had to be mindful of as the story developed were that children may live with adults who were not their parents, and we had to be mindful about how this was portrayed in the story. And you can see later on if you look at the link or have a hard copy of the book, that our two main characters, we don't explicitly say that they're parents. They are known as Big Star and Other Big Star. Some children lived in families in which parents had separated, and there were various stages of substance use treatment and recovery that were associated with the both negative and positive impact upon family relationships. So we had to be mindful of this when writing the story, to try and make it as relevant to as many children and families as possible. And that we also had to consider that the level of knowledge, particularly given that this was aimed at 5 to 8-year-olds, would vary hugely with children, and that they would have different experiences, as Simon alluded to, of parents really kind of not telling children anything, to children being explicitly told about their parents' substance use. So our story would follow the experiences of our main character, Artie, the wishing star, in being able to grant her first wish. And these are just kind of some more illustrations that kind of aided our conversation around character development and the development really of Artie, the wishing star. You can see there that she would be strong-minded, but shy and bubbly. This was part of the process from our author and illustrator, who we had to at first work out the story before any of the illustration could start. So there was a lot of kind of going backwards and forwards to families and checking out the story, making sure, particularly with the children, that it resonated with them, that it was coherent, and that it was what they wanted to share with other children and young people. And I have to say the author and illustrator that we had were absolutely fabulous, and were really part of the team. So we had the basis of our story, and this continued to be developed. There were some changes along the way that we had to make, as you would expect. One of our main characters is now called the Other Big Star, and that represents the parent who doesn't use substances but is very much a supportive role to Artie, the child character in the story. And this character was initially called the Star Sweeper, but this developed over time to be called Other Big Star, so that there was some similarity between Other Big Star and Big Star, the substance using caregiver, so that there was some similarity in how the characters looked and children could relate to that. Substance use in our story is now represented through a character called a yozzle. and this character was originally called the Menace, but was changed in response to families not wanting to portray a blaming attitude towards the parent who used substances. So the Yodel was a character that is made up, many that you kind of similarly find in like Roald Dahl stories, made up characters that doesn't necessarily have any prior meaning, but then they were portrayed in a way that children could associate it as being a disruptive and mischievous character. So these again are some of the slides of the development of the artwork that went on, and these were processes that always involved families. So they would involve home visits or discussions by email, whichever way really worked best for them. But we visited the families on many occasions to do read aloud story versions to check how. Oh, sorry. Yeah, got you.
I was just trying to say just another 3 minutes, and then we'll have
perfect.
some time for
that's
questions.
Absolutely great.
Brilliant.
Thank you. I skipped too far there. So this is just to demonstrate some of the beginnings of our characters. So you can see there the start of the Yodel and the development of some of the illustrations. And again, on the subsequent slide, Artie is on the right, our wishing star, and on the left, having a conversation with our other big stars, saying that she's finding things difficult. So the key messages of our book, our Yodel again. The key messages of our book, based on the findings of our studies, are that children are not alone and that other children have similar experiences. And Artie portrays that by the stars that are in the sky at the end of the story that then become visible to her after she's spoken to somebody and confided in them. That children are not responsible for the needs and welfare of adult family members, and that's particularly important when children don't have contact with other children who have similar experiences, and offers some reassurance. And it clearly gives the message that speaking to a trusted adult about how you feel can be a positive experience, and I think that's a relevant message. I think that most people would agree is useful to give to children. So in terms of sharing it, we're continuing to promote the book and have done through different charities that work with children, both locally and nationally. And are happy to do that if you're in contact with any and you would like the book to be promoted through organisations. There is a read aloud version of the book that is available on YouTube. The link is here, and I will also post it in the chat. Please use it. Please spread it far and wide. We want it to be used by as many families and practitioners as possible. We do have hard copies available of the book. So if you are based in the UK, this is it, and you would like us to post a copy if you happen to work directly with young people or may know families who are impacted by it, then please get in touch. We're happy to send you a copy of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon and Deborah, for that wonderful presentation. Really, really interesting, and it's very encouraging to see how this research can be linked to the development of outputs that are responding to some of the findings, at least, that emerge certainly from your research, Simon. Now we just have 5 minutes left for hopefully some interesting discussion and questions from the floor. Really interesting. Just one thing before we open it up for questions. Obviously, a key challenge, if you like, with working with parents and caregivers of children is trying to provide kind of age-appropriate resources. Just remind us, Debbie, the resource that you developed, what was the age range that you're kind of targeting?
So primarily it was 5 to 8 year olds. In the development of the book, there was a teacher who contributed to the group that worked in a school that was predominantly for children with special educational needs, and did see the opportunity to use it with older children. But I mean, the illustrations in the book, I am biased, but the illustrations are beautiful. So I think it just depends on, you know, what children are drawn to in a book, and obviously on their age and stage of development. Yeah.
So it could be potentially, depending on the child,
Yeah.
could be for slightly older children or even slightly younger children. Brilliant,
Yeah.
brilliant. And Simon, just of interest, the kinship carers in your study, they obviously were involved, probably a large percentage of them with child protection, social services, I presume. Where what came through was, you know, a lot of the focus of the intervention is all about the child and the safety of the child, and a lot less about, you know, taking a kind of what I would call a family systems approach. You know, it's all very child focused and child centered. How much do you think that influences the kind of longer term support that these families were clearly asking for and needing? If it is child-focused intervention and purely about child protection, how much do you think that really influences the kind of support that's provided to these families?
Yeah, and I think certainly from the caregivers that we spoke to, there was this sense of, you know, this happened quite suddenly. They were given sudden responsibility for the children, and obviously, yeah, didn't occur to them to say no, but they felt obliged to do so and had to just cope and in at the deep end. And so, as I alluded to before, it wasn't until at some point later that things reached a crisis that they were not coping, that they eventually did have to get some support, but they often tried to cope by themselves and weren't able to access that support, or often did find some support, but weren't aware that that support was there until it was almost too late, perhaps.
That's really interesting. I'm going to open it up for questions now, and I'm just going to look at whoever raises their hand first. And I think it's Richard. Come on in, Richard.
Typical. Okay, I've got two very quick questions. The first one is, do you have any plans for doing this for an older age group? It's wonderful doing it for 5 to 8s, but I also know that there are lots of children older than that, young teenagers, who are also struggling a lot, and it looks like a very good resource. The second thing is, what are your plans? How do you evaluate the effectiveness of something like this?
I'm going to take your second question first, Richard. That is something that we're currently working on. Particularly Ruth has big plans for Artie, and we're looking at how we can evaluate the use of this as a universal intervention in primary schools. It does currently have some questions in that can be used in classrooms that prompts teachers to have conversations with children around the emotions that different characters might experience and things like that. So we are currently having discussions about how to evaluate the effectiveness of it and the use of tools such as strengths and difficulties questionnaires. How we would specifically measure that for children who are impacted by parental substance use is really quite tricky in that age group. And we haven't come up with a specific answer to that yet. The first question about developing for older children, Ruth has had conversations, when we've had conversations with the team about whether we follow Artie as a character as she grows up and has different experiences and copes with different things. But I suppose we've had quite a lot of interest in the book in a way that maybe we didn't anticipate, and I think we're kind of just seeing what opportunities arise to explore the use of it, really.
Interesting. I look forward to watching the movie and the children's television series and the merchandising that will
I was going to say whole merchandise and different brands.
The merchandising will mean that you won't have any funding problems in the future.
Okay, and I just see Ed also has, I think we have time for one more question. Ed?
Yeah, really good resource, and I look forward to seeing it. A question, if you're rolling it out to schools, parents, other workers, do you have guidance? Now, maybe you've said this and I missed it, is there guidance or, training to make use of it the way you would intend it to?
We don't currently have that. No, there are some prompt questions that can be used that we think would align with how teachers maybe talk to children currently about emotions. But in terms of it being specific to children who are impacted by parent or substance use, in the next phase of our project, what we're looking at is how we incorporate things like training as well, and how it's used, for example, at a whole school within an assembly setting and a classroom setting with follow-on sessions. And we expect to give very clear structure and assembly plans and teaching plans that would align with the curriculum as well. Yeah, so we recognise that there'll be a need for that, but we don't currently have that. No.
That'd be really useful. If it's any use, when we got using Rory from Alcohol Focus Scotland, we thought there was needed to be some guidance for parents if they're going to use it. So if you drop me an email, I'm happy to send you that. It's only a double-sided H, but happy to send it to you.
Great, thank you very much. That would be really helpful.
So thank you very much again, Simon and Debbie, for presenting a really interesting presentation. So